Welcome to Module 1. In this module, you'll be learning about adaptation by natural selection. The first question is, what is anthropology? Anthropology is the study of humankind. Anthropos is human, and ology literally means the study of. Anthropology is both cross-cultural and studies humans through time. The root questions of biological anthropology are: what does it mean to be human? How did we become who we are today? How does our biological past influence our lives and the environments of the present? And what is the place of human beings in nature? We're going to be answering all of these questions in this course. Biological anthropology, or physical anthropology, is a wide-ranging interdisciplinary field of social science that uses evolution as the foundation for understanding the place of humans in the natural world. It's based on the scientific method, the steps of which include asking a question, doing background research, constructing a hypothesis, testing your hypothesis by doing experiments, analyzing your data, drawing conclusions, and finally communicating your results. One of the major themes in biological anthropology is the continuum of life, asking the question, where do humans fit in the classification of all living things? We're life forms, animals, mammals, and primates. There were several early foundational thinkers who were thinking and theorizing and postulating about humans and biological change before Charles Darwin in the 1850s. And it's these thinkers, these scholars, who we're going to learn more about now. Both John Ray and Carolus Linnaeus proposed classification schemes for living organisms, the study of taxonomy or systematics. John Ray provided the very first definition of the concept of a genus and species, and Carolus Linnaeus developed a system of classification and the basis for taxonomy, a classification system we still use today. For instance, based on the Linnaean system of classification, you can see where Homo sapiens are categorized, down from our kingdom, Animalia, down to our species, Sapiens. The image here depicts an artist's rendition of an anatomically modern Homo sapien on the left, facing Homo erectus, a species with whom we share a genus and who we will learn more about during this course. Another foundational thinker was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who revolutionized the way that we think about the interaction of an organism and their environment. He attempted a scientific explanation of evolution, and he coined the term biology. He recognized this interaction of organism through environment by what he called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck argued that physiological need promoted the formation of new organs or the alterations of old ones, and that these acquired characteristics would be passed on to future generations. The example that he's most famous for is the giraffe, depicted here. He hypothesized that an original ancestral short-necked giraffe would keep stretching its neck to reach leaves that would be placed higher up on the tree in order to survive. This giraffe would then continue to stretch his neck throughout his lifetime until it became longer, and that this long neck would then be passed on to his offspring. Although we now know that the inheritance of acquired characteristics does not function the way that Lamarck originally hypothesized, we do now appreciate the role that environment can play in something that's called epigenetics, something that we'll be learning about in other modules throughout this course. The Darwinian Revolution took place in the 1800s. Two men, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with the same theory to explain biological change. From 1834 to 1836, the naturalist Charles Darwin traveled on the HMS Beagle around the world. His voyages yield several important scientific discoveries: major multi-volume works on coral reefs, several really important works on barnacles that are still studied today. And in 1844, he collected all of his secret notes on his thoughts on evolution, drafted his ideas to a famous naturalist at the time, and was planning to publish his ideas when he received a letter from a young man named Alfred Russel Wallace, who had independently come up with almost the identical theory to explain biological change. While they were both invited to a conference to present their ideas, Charles Darwin was given the opportunity to publish first, and he is now the most famous thinker on evolutionary theory. Information from biology, anatomy, taxonomy, geology, paleontology have led to the acceptance of this idea of change by the scientific community by the late 1800s. But how, or by what process or mechanism evolutionary change occurs, was still largely debated. The answer is adaptation by natural selection. Adaptation argues that features of an organism are created by the process of natural selection. Adaptations are complex in particularly and highly improbable ways. One great example of a complex adaptation is the human eye. Any changes in the structure would prevent the eye from functioning, and we would no longer recognize it as what we call an eye. There's almost no chance that a complex structure like the human eye would arise by change in a single trial. If it did, it would be, as Sir Frederick Hoyle proclaimed, like a hurricane blowing through a junkyard and chancing to assemble a Boeing 747. Darwin's theory of adaptation and his ideas on natural selection were incredibly important to our thinking. Before Darwin, there was no scientific explanation for the fact that organisms are well adapted to their environment and to their circumstances. There are three postulates of natural selection. The first is the struggle for existence. Populations can expand infinitely, but an environment's ability to support that population is finite. Stated another way, environmental pressures present challenges to species so that not all are able to survive in order to reproduce. The second postulate is variation in fitness. Organisms within a population may vary, and this variation affects an individual's ability to reproduce and survive. Stated in a different way, variation in traits exist within species. And lastly, the third postulate of natural selection is inheritance of variation, that variation is transmitted from parents to offspring, that variation can be inherited. When these three postulates hold, natural selection produces adaptation. Darwin's finches are incredibly important to understanding the way that natural selection and adaptation work. Natural selection has no foresight. It causes organisms to change so that they are better adapted to their particular ecology, to their current environment. One great example are medium ground finches on the island of Daphne Major in the Galapagos. Birds with deep beaks were much less likely to die during drought than birds with shallow beaks because they could access the hard and very difficult to process seeds, the leftovers. This meant that their probability of survival increased. This is a perfect example of natural selection. There are two types of variation, continuous and discontinuous. Continuous variation is where there is a continuum of types. Darwin argued that continuous variation is essential for evolution of complex adaptations, which can arise even through the accumulation of very small random variations by natural selection. One example of continuous variation is human height. Discontinuous variation, on the other hand, is variation in which there is a discrete number of types with no intermediate types. Darwin did not think that discontinuous variation was important in evolution because complex adaptations are unlikely to arise in a single jump. An example of discontinuous variation is peak color in Mendel's breeding experiments, which we'll be learning about in the next module. The evolution of complex adaptations means that new organisms are created by small modifications of existing organisms, not by starting with the clean slate. Natural selection acting over time can lead to complex adaptations, but it can do so only if each change along the way is adaptive. Adaptations by natural selection are not by chance. One example is that sometimes unrelated species have independently evolved the same adaptation, like the wing of a bird, a bat, or an insect. Convergence is the evolution of similar adaptations in genetically unrelated groups of animals. Divergence, on the other hand, is the evolution of different adaptations by related species. One example is Darwin's finches. One way to think about this is to think of evolution producing adaptations like a tinkerer, not an engineer. One great example of convergence is looking at marsupials versus placentals. Marsupial and placental animals have similar adaptations to food supplies, locomotion, and climate. However, they separated from a common ancestor more than 100 million years ago, meaning that each lineage continued to evolve independently. Marsupial mammals are from Australia, placental mammals from North America. This is a case in which two animals have evolved to fill the same ecological niche in different parts of the world. The example you see on the screen here is the marsupial wolf versus the placental wolf. Both give live birth, but marsupials do not have long gestation times like placentals. They give birth early, and the helpless infant or embryo climbs from the birth canal to the nipples and continues to develop for weeks or months. The last common ancestor of the marsupial and placental wolf was something like a tree shrew 125 million years ago. Most relationships are based on homology, shared ancestry, rather than analogy, similarity due to response, of selection pressure. We're going to explore the differences between convergent and divergent evolution in the next slide. One example of homology is the skeleton of vertebrates. You can see that structures derived from a common ancestral structure that may or may not be used for the same function in the species in which it occurs are called homologous structure. For example, here you see the flipper of a dolphin, the arm of a person, the foreleg of a horse, and the wing of a bat. All are derived from a common vertebral ancestral structure, but are not used for the same locomotor function. An example of analogy, on the other hand, is a wing. It is found in 2 different species and serves the same function. It's not derived from a common ancestral structure. Here you see examples of wings on a bird, a bat, and a butterfly. Although all are used for flying and therefore serve the same function, they're not due to shared genetic ancestry. It's also important to remember rates of evolutionary change as we move into the next 3 modules looking at forces of evolution. More complex changes typically take longer to evolve, but we can see big changes in relatively short periods of time. One example is the change from domesticated dogs to wolves. We have to remember, however, that most changes in the fossil record are much slower. We're going to be exploring all of the forces of evolutionary change and mechanisms of evolutionary selection in the next 3 modules.